Hello, good afternoon, good evening. We are continuing with our seminar on communication and politics. Perhaps we are reaching the most interesting part, talking with protagonists on the political sphere. Two wonderful guests today who are politicians, although perhaps now they have taken a step back from the political world and they're on standby. We know that it's hard to really give up politics. It's a bit like a drug, and you always follow it very closely after being involved directly. The people here today are very well known, but nonetheless, I would like to just say a little bit about each of them. So if we start off with Meritxell Batet, very well known, of course, because of her position as a speaker in the Congress. Before that, she was a minister and worked as the territorial politics minister as well. Before that, she was known for her involvement in the PSC, and it's true that I have always seen her as a person who was very responsible when it came to exercising her functions, but she always kept a certain distance from the political battle. What we're interested in right now is an analysis. We don't want to talk about party politics. For this reason, I think that the people we have with us today are ideal for that. José Luis Ayllón. Well, we have shared conversations. We haven't always coincided in our collaborations, but we have on some occasions. He's been very involved in politics in a very interesting position because he has an overall perspective, which is wonderful because he was the head of the cabinet for Rajoy's government. That's a wonderful position, and he was an MP and Secretary of State for relationships with the Parliament. So our two guests today have a very direct link with Parliament. And obviously, one of the things we will discuss here are the debates that we hear in the Parliament. I'd like to start off referring to the political being. We're talking about a profession. Well, I remember a journalist once asked me, in my case, I was chairman of the CIS, and some people don't forget that. And people presume that I'm up to date of all of the surveys. The question was, why do people hate politicians? And then we'll talk about the media. I think that's very important as well. We cannot understand political language without talking about the media. And the answer I gave was, well, politics is a profession just like any other, but with one very important difference, that you always have somebody who is observing your work. Imagine if we had 4, 5, or 6, or 20 different media firms following surgeons or university professors, teachers in schools, or the workers in a company. Who would be safe? Nobody. So immediately, people would have a different view of other professions. And within democracies, we understand that politicians are always being observed. But this also means that when you work in politics, well, there's a 24-hour demand on politicians, above all now that we have mobile phones, and you could say they never stop working, but it also demands great responsibility. And politicians face a certain lack of understanding. That's how I see it, at least. People don't quite understand what it is to be a politician. Before talking more about communication, perhaps I would be interested in you talking about how you have perceived the role of politicians. So besides talking about the sense of responsibility, I imagine there's also an element related to commitment and ethical, of course. People get involved in politics because they want to make things work better. José Luis, is it okay if we start off with you? And also thinking of other politicians. It's not just about your own perception, but perhaps others that you've worked with. Okay, well, I would just like to say thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, to be able to participate in these talks invited by Fernando, finding myself once again with Meritxell and being here in this room to talk about several issues, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I'm going to try to offer some thoughts in case somebody might find them useful and perhaps helpful. So I hope that I will be useful today. Fernando said, with very good criteria, that people that work in politics, well, I don't talk about a profession, I talk about an activity, because I've always felt that the activity should be temporary. It is not a good thing, in my opinion, and I respect others who may have a different opinion. I don't think it should be for your entire life. It shouldn't be permanent, because otherwise you may not be quite fully in touch with reality. I'm a bad example because I've come from the youth groups in the party. But coming back to the subject of it being observed, and you've asked me to also think of other politicians' viewpoints. And I would just say that during the years in politics and the 5 years that have gone by since I left politics, I've often been asked, well, I've been offered, I'm thinking of joining as a candidate for a council. People ask my advice, and I always say that the most beautiful activity I've carried out is as a politician serving society. It's going to be hard to find anything as fulfilling. It has good and bad moments, more bad moments, I would say. I think Meritxell might agree with that. But I always say that you have to be ready. Just as you mentioned in your question, you have to be ready for that observation. So when you take the step to carry out that activity, then you are going to be subjected, and not just you, but the people around you are going to be subjected to observation. I don't know if you've noticed, if you go to Google, you type in a politician's name, and the third or fourth one on the list will talk about the wife, husband, partner. So the search engine in internet already takes you to information about their family. The second thing, or the next one down, would be the salary, and the fourth one must probably be properties that they have to declare to the authorities, because that's public information, and that makes the whole thing more difficult. And we shouldn't forget that, well, if surgeons were observed or professors at university were observed, but imagine it not just observing them, you had surgeons against other surgeons. So it's not just that you're being observed by society in general, regular citizens, but there are some surgeons concerned about what the other surgeons are doing to try to get some kind of advantage in the political discourse. And in the end, when there is less politics in the political discourse, then the greater the aggression at a personal level, the more people focus on the questionable morals amongst political competitors. And that makes the whole situation much more complicated. The conclusion from all of this, well, it makes me think, and it's not because I've left it already, but fewer of the good guys are carrying out this activity. That's my impression. I think if you look at the political figures from the Spanish transition, I think they were better in their respective spheres. And now I think perhaps there is more fear. And if this talk serves any purpose, then I would take the opportunity to encourage people to overcome the fear of participating. You have to allow yourselves to be observed. But if you have a political vocation, you should exercise that. Because if you don't, well, I mean, politics is necessary for democracy. If you don't do it, then others will do it much worse. And that's all I wanted to say. Meritxell, what's your vision? I imagine you coincide to a large degree. Yes, I could just say I completely agree and then stop talking. But I thank you very much. Thank you, Fernando, and the institution for providing us with this opportunity to reflect a little bit out loud amongst friends in good company. And what's more, with an enlightened audience who I am sure will be encouraged to participate, because I think it's important to exchange our thoughts and positions. I would like to also say thank you to Fernando, because he has wanted to start this debate, allowing us to defend politics. Because I think that one of the obligations, and that's what I felt as the speaker in the Congress, I felt that I had an obligation, but not just because of my position, but also a moral obligation to defend politics, to defend Parliament and politicians, whilst also being aware that everybody hates politicians. But that same everybody thinks that democracy is the best of the systems in which we can live and organize ourselves. And this is actually contradictory. And if we talk about public institutions, and I would take the opportunity to defend democratic institutions as well, but we cannot have institutions without people holding the positions in those institutions, and these people are the politicians. I think that we could have an obligatory political service as a social thing. I say this, well, almost as a joke, but I would be inspired by other examples, because I think that this service to community, this commitment to everything we have in common and the construction of a space between the state and society, as has been said by others, such as Habermas, I think that this is something very important, to be aware as a society of the commitment involved and how important this is. Most politicians, the vast majority of politicians, think about this when they decide to work in politics. Even a councillor in a very small town, right through to the MPs in different legislative assemblies, and of course those in the executive body, the advisors and the ministers. I think that there really is a desire to serve and improve society and improve people's lives. I share with Fernando and Ayllón that indeed this is a profession or activity which is observed 24 hours, 7 days a week, and nobody can withstand that. There is no human being that can withstand that. When people might say, well, no, I listened to you, I heard you in a conversation when you were having a wine with so-and-so. What's more, this activity is one in which everybody is against everybody. So, well, in almost all professions, there's a kind of a collective position. We group together and defend ourselves within that profession. But no, in politics, it's different. Whenever you get a chance, you criticize others because you're competing with others in order to reach perhaps maybe a more interesting position or higher position, and with those from the other groups also, because they are competitors in the elections, and what you want to do is to win the elections and govern in as many places as possible. So I think that indeed the conditions are not easy. Therefore, it's easy for us to suffer excessive criticism and scrutiny, much too much for a human being to be able to withstand. And I read in a book once that, well, it was a politician saying that they felt that they could never lose their calm in any situation as a politician. And I mean, we can see this out in the streets even. And there are people that, attack you in the streets verbally for the moment, but I don't rule out the possibility of needing physical protection given the way things are going. But verbal attacks, which are very frequent at the moment, or at least, well, I suffer them quite a lot. Any other citizen, well, if you hear somebody say something, you would answer them, but we don't. We are accustomed to putting up with those insults, those verbal attacks. We're used to just having to keep quiet. And that is something which is difficult. It's not that we have thicker skin. We don't have skin like rhinos, as some people sometimes say, but you don't get used to it either. We are human beings, just like everybody else. And some people are by nature less sensitive, perhaps because that's just their personality. But indeed, the pain caused by that attack, the way it affects you in a personal level, is the same just as it would be for anybody else. So I would take this chance to ask for everybody to remember the humanity of politicians. Sometimes we forget this. We see people on the screen, and this helps to dehumanize these people sometimes. But I would just take this opportunity to say that there are real people behind the political figure, and I would like to link up to something that I hope we will discuss further during our debate. Ayllón already mentioned this, and I think it's very interesting when you said that in the absence of content, what you have are insults and attacks and emotion, a lot of passion, a lot of emotion. And politics is, of course, all about passion, but I think that it has to be, above all, rational. Rational thinking has to be the driving force for politics, although, of course, emotion is important. Just like everything in life, that's important. But a lack of content is something that we're observing in recent times. By way of introduction, that was fantastic. And now we're going to talk about political language and the media. Both of you have brought up a subject that I think is really fundamental, which is the code which governs politicians or politics. And we hear a lot of talk about this relationship of adversaries or enemies. Perhaps the public is unaware of the fact that this is something absolutely inevitable, because the democratic system has a component which inevitably leads to confrontation, even in the way that reality is described. So the government describes a certain reality according to its own interests, of course, but the opposition is obliged to represent that reality in a completely different way. This is good for the public because it means they can see the two sides to the same reality. But don't you think that this has become more pronounced recently and has led to radical polarization on the one hand? And secondly, don't you also perhaps think that it's a little bit imposed or forced? Let's see if I can explain myself, because in the end, the need to offer a contradictory viewpoint may lead to people thinking that any vision of reality is valid, and that would be what brings us to post-truth. So in other words, I follow or I accept the vision of my political party, the ones that I consider within my group, and I would ignore the opposition's viewpoint or presentation of reality. And so we have the inevitable debate and welcome debate, in fact. But we could say that in democracies, with this insistence that everything is something that can be interpreted differently. So we have the government's perspective, and then the opposition has its point of view. And what you do is you take a leap of faith, and you've talked about the importance of thinking rationally. But of course, we have to provide arguments and rationale, and the best argument has to win if we are logical beings. But in the end, ultimately, the best argument doesn't always win. Sometimes it's just, let's say, party politics. There are politicians who have said that almost literally punching each other in the Congress, they go out for a beer. They have a pleasant relationship, a friendly relationship. And so in the Congress or in Parliament, we might see a rather theatrical presentation of a very tense atmosphere. So we have people that, seem to be arguing and completely opposed, but then they have kind of semi-secret meetings to reach agreements. Do you think, well, I think this perhaps leads people to mistrust politics, this need for these arguments, this conflict. Should we start with you, Meritxell, perhaps? If you want. Yes, there's no problem. Let's see. I think that, well, I'm going to go straight to the last question, but I think that we have to start off with a diagnosis. And that is that we're talking about fragmented politics, but I think we have to be aware that society has changed. And that is what really leads to the change in politics and also in communication, because society has changed. In other words, we have a society which is much more fragmented, much more polarized, which has changed the way it communicates and relates with each other, is much more fragmented. And right now, there's a lot less discussion and debate, whether it's amongst friends, fellow employees, in your family. There is little debate. Debates are constantly interrupted by an electronic device that we have on the table when we have breakfast, dinner, or lunch. So an alarm goes off, you look at it, or you look for information, a piece of information that you can't remember, above all when you get to a certain age, and which makes it necessary to consult absolutely everything. And as a result, conversations, debates have changed entirely, and so society is fragmented. It's true that there is a huge, or much greater availability and representation in parliaments is much more diverse, which could be positive. More people in society can feel represented or feel that they have representatives that they can identify with greater strength in parliament. And that could be something considered positive. But this also brings with it the fact that you need to be more able to reach agreements, that you need a greater capacity to reach agreements. And this is where we have the problem. There is greater diversity, plurality, more fragmentation. And that means it's more necessary to reach agreements with people who think differently, with the parties with which you do not share a huge amount. But you have to find the sufficient majorities in order to continue to respond to the requirements of the parliament, of the parliamentary function, which is the nerve center of political life. Therefore, I think it's very important for us to be aware that fragmentation comes from society. And as a result, we have a more fragmented parliament. And after that, communication is no longer carried out exclusively by professionals. And that is also a problem. It's a problem when it comes to complying with a constitutional mandate. It was mainly in the past via media channels, and it's all about the right to information, the right to provide and have access to information. The citizens have the right to receive true information, and that's laid down in our constitution. I think that nowadays, it's much more difficult to fulfill that mandate because the channels have increased to such a degree that it is hard to identify where I can get the most reliable information. And Liebman said something very important about this. He said that we cannot guarantee that we have free citizens in societies where there are not sufficient instruments in order to be able to differentiate lies from the truth. And we are at this time of post-truth indeed, but this is because society has changed, and that's the setting in which we find ourselves. People don't go for coffee anymore in the parliament. And I'm coming to your question. Some might think, well, it's more coherent because in the past we had a kind of performance. And I will give my opinion in a very informal way. I think it's really dramatic. It's really quite dramatic. It's necessary to be able to go and have a coffee with people who think differently to you. I want a society in which I can live with people who do not think in the same way as me. And I have to demonstrate that I have that capacity to go for a coffee with this gentleman. Yes, and then to be able to discuss with passion perhaps, but respectfully, in Parliament. Because in Parliament, in the Congress, well, you said, it may appear to be something fictional, but no, it's not fictional because the debate is the culmination of a process that has needed discrete spaces, let's say, not secret, but it's important to have discretion. What you do is that you construct agreements which afterwards you kind of perform, let's say, and you may even have agreed on the discrepancies and the disagreements. But the space for agreement is huge. It's huge in almost all fields. It doesn't matter what we're talking about: education, health, defense, justice, culture. It makes no difference. The areas of agreement are huge. So, of course, we have to work outside of this spotlight in order to reach agreements. And obviously, we have to have respectful relations. We have to respect people who think differently to us, and this is basic. And this was broken. And in the previous legislature, we had the pandemic, which has had a much greater impact than perhaps we may think right now. It has had a huge impact because during a long period, the MPs were limited in attending Parliament, and electronic voting was introduced. So you didn't have spaces to meet and get to know the people you had opposite you, to hear about their parents, children, the fact that they like dogs or they have a problem with their neighbour, because they are people, just like you are. And even the most horrendous party that you can imagine, each person has one in mind. But even the people that belong to that party are people. They are human beings. Therefore, creating that kind of complicity is basic in order to overcome this fragmentation that we see in society, in order to channel the agreements that really structure the public life of a country, which is done via Parliament. I'm going to try to follow on from the last part, well, perhaps not the very last part, about the fact that people don't have coffees. And Meritxell has been there longer than me. I left before Meritxell, and Meritxell has seen a part that I have not seen. But in my time, we had coffees and we had discreet conversations about important issues. And we don't even have to think outside of the people present here. And it's very difficult to have a coffee with somebody and then afterwards say something outrageous and scandalous to them in the Parliament. I have very good relationships with MPs who, well, you might think, what's somebody doing from the PP with Rufián or Joan Tardá with a good personal relationships? I found it very difficult to say certain things to him. Even though, well, that would have been in line perhaps with the political arguments. I'm following on from what Meritxell has said, though, and I was tempted to call you to kind of organise ourselves. It's to reach an agreement. No, not an agreement, but to kind of organise ourselves. And I said no, because then it will be boring, because we'll already know what we're going to be doing. But here I have a phrase which is almost the same as what you've said. Perhaps I'm going a little further, and I'll try to be, well, I'll just say plurality is not what it was. Plurality has failed us from my point of view. A large part of the problems that we have are based on a positive concept of plurality, and I'm trying to explain myself. I'm a defender of the bi-party system, of the two-party system, and we tried to put an end to the two-party system, that great evil that had come to corrupt our democratic system. So parties appeared, supported by media firms, to get rid of the two-party system. I think it will come back, but that's a different debate. And we've turned the two-party system into or a bi-party system into bi-blocking system. And maybe in the past we could have said, Meritxell, if we talk about this proposal, how about this amendment? And I was only concerned about Meritxell's opinion and my party's opinion. I wasn't looking to Vox And I think, what's Vox going to say when I talk to Meritxell? And Meritxell wasn't thinking, Sumar are going to look at me in disgust. These blocks have internal discrepancies which can be used to insist on polarization. And so plurality has failed us. And what about the media? In Spain, we have many more media channels and media firms because we have more standard, conventional ones. We have the TV, radio, newspapers. There are many more digital channels. And as Meritxell says, each individual is a potential journalist because they can use the social media to give their point of view. So we have a lot more media channels and a lot less information. Plurality has not brought us to a world in which we have greater access to information, in which our rights are respected. No. But what's more, the communication media has become like a football club. I mean, I support Barcelona, and the other day I saw a goal that the Madrid supporters didn't see, and the Madrid supporters saw a penalty that I didn't see. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that this has been taken to all areas, and in the media and in social networks, the fact that we are hyper-connected, like Meritxell said, we have our phones next to us at breakfast, lunch and dinner. We are hyper-connected, but really we are disconnected because who do we follow? Maybe the people here have more interest in hearing what other people think, other people with different views, but most citizens follow their preferred media channel, their preferred newspaper. They have a group of friends in Twitter or X or Facebook or all the different media, which is just a constant echo. You get a lot of information, but it's all just saying the same. I think that deep down we don't really know what other people think. And if we take that to Parliament, in two ways. So you have MPs that only reads their newspaper, only listens to their TV or radio channel or watches their TV channel. They only know the opinion of the people that support them in the media channels so that they can say something even more outrageous the next day in Parliament than they did last week. I'm not against pluralism. I don't want you to get that idea, but I think that the plurality that we have constructed or that has been constructed for us or that we are constructed has failed us. Sorry, just one note here. There's something that has been mentioned and it's come to mind right now and I wanted to share it. I think that the Parliament should be different from what we have in the streets. In the streets we have protests, a room for complaint and demands, but it does not construct or create anything. In the street you can demand and claim and complain, but then this has to be structured and channeled through the Parliament. So I think that there is a parallelism between this Parliament and street duality and the media and social media. And it's kind of similar. Communication media are to the social media what Parliament is to the streets. So the media channels have to demand of themselves that they comply with the constitutional mandate. I understand that the conventional media channels, we're talking about media firms, and they need to earn money. I understand that, and I support it. I think it's great that we have companies, and they have to earn money. I understand that perfectly well. But the problem comes when this is deformed and they become too similar to social networks, to the social media, because that means they are not complying with their mandate. And if we have a well-informed and educated society, that's what it needs. We should ask MPs to develop arguments. They should be less passionate and be more rational. They should offer more content, more substance. In the same way that we should ask them to provide that, I hope we can come to discussing what we should demand of MPs. I think that the media channels should be more rigorous. They should carry out in-depth work and should not be tempted by this easy, fast information. Fernando, this is working by itself. I don't need to be here. If we talk about media, conventional media perhaps, and social media, well, I think that a lot of media firms have been contaminated. They want to get easy headlines, but here we're talking about the ones we might consider to be serious, newspapers, for example, newspaper headlines, and they give headlines as if they were a tweet, so they can get this as a trending topic because it means it will attract attention. But I've forgotten one thing. I always want to say something positive because, well, we'll all just get depressed, and that's not a good thing. This week is a bad one, but this week in the Spanish Parliament, there was a plenary session of the Congress and a plenary of the Senate, and there were 10 or 12 committee sessions in each of the chambers. Because of my current job, I follow parliamentary activity, and I am also curious about it. Most of the committees, well, I was going to say it's a bad week, but in a normal week, you'd have a committee for civil service, another one for agriculture in the Congress, and most of these committees or commissions have finished with agreements, transactional agreements, perhaps not between the two blocks, but perhaps with the abstention of the PP and the abstention of the PSOE when there's an agreement with Junts and PP. Junts and PP may have voted for something and the PSOE hasn't voted against it. So we're still talking about a low-intensity parliament that can reach agreements. And Meritxell, you know that from your experience as a speaker. It's true that during the pandemic that made a difference. But we still have a parliament with debates and activity. But where do we see the worst? Well, investigation committees, the control sessions, debates that go to the Congress that are just looking to increase tension. This week, for example, there were two proposals, one about the treatment of people with ELA, and another one about the protection of wolves and all of the issues with livestock. And they've been held and there were no great conflicts, but on Wednesday morning things changed. So there is room for hope, for arguments, logical arguments. It's not just about throwing things at each other day after day. If we talk about communication, well, you've described what's happening. You've talked about a mixture of the previous paradigm, the media democracy, in that democracy works in such a way that there is a kind of stage for the political world, and that is in the form of the media firms. And within this idea, the public would be observing this staging of politics. But if we have the digital situation is quite chaotic. We don't have one single scene or stage, sorry. So you have to continue with the performance on that stage. That goes to the radio, TV, you give press interviews. But then we have another very chaotic set of stages where there is a manipulation of what you say, where they're looking for confrontation for the sake of it. And this is what has led to a qualitative change. And I think it's important. We've analysed this, in fact, in some of the other sessions. And the traditional media, you've just actually said this implicitly, that they are beginning to be contaminated by the logic behind the social media. So their selection of news stories is such that it's all about representing the news stories that sell. So we're talking about short messages, looking for confrontation. What is the selection on the television channels, for example? Of course, they select moments of conflict because that attracts attention. And this affects politics, of course, and it also affects other social activities. And ultimately, what it generates is terrible competition between the media in order to attract attention. People are trapped by emotions rather than reason or arguments. So we're talking about pure confrontation, and what catches attention would be, for example, corruption, scandal. But a debate about wolves, for example, would not attract attention. Or even more important debates about tax policies, for example, don't attract attention. So what I'm trying to come to is that as the media firms have changed, well, first of all, we saw the radio and language had to be developed. For the radio, it was different than talking in public. Then we saw television, and Tony Blair described this, because this was the time when spin began officially, this attempt to frame messages in a subtle way to attract political observers, in other words, citizens, to bring people to your terrain in order to eliminate any alternative definition. And what we're facing now is that politicians have to adapt to the new reality of social media, because social media are colonizing the media firms. We see that the media are informing more and more about what happens in the social media. They're not looking at reality. They're looking at the social media's reflection of reality. So, of course, and Elvira Lindo complained about this the other day, the fact that we have lost sight of information and we're just going for opinions, because opinions are much cheaper. And we haven't mentioned the economic crisis of journalism as an activity. Of course, they are obliged, they see themselves obliged to encourage clicks because their survival depends on having something attractive enough to obtain an audience, which will mean that they can attract advertising income. There are a lot of digital media which just offer opinions for things maybe from agencies, and then the rest of it are just opinion articles. You don't have to pay correspondents. You don't have to have reporters out on the streets. So it's very cheap. But on the other hand, this is impoverishing. And here, I'm taking this opportunity to ask a few questions. Have you noticed that when there is a discussion now compared to 15, 20 years ago, when there's a discussion now, how you have to respond to something that comes or appears in the media? People look for an answer which is catchy. So answering or responding to a scandal with something that will have a similar impact. And of course, this is all very, very quick. You have to instantly respond because otherwise the adversary will have achieved their objective of leaving you out and perhaps harming you with their comments. No doubt it's very difficult to actually schedule anything. You have to be ready to change your discourse constantly. I don't know whether this has affected you personally, although I imagine it probably has. You may have had to say to Rajoy, well, from here on we have to reorganize everything, and you, in your position as a minister, above all, you would have had to react to news items, news stories that appear and explode. From my experience in the CIS, well, all of a sudden a digital media would say the CIS has a survey hidden in a drawer that gives the president 10 points less than what was published. And you have to answer instantly. They ask for an instant answer. And I don't think that this is good for what you mentioned, Meritxell, which is the whole thing of a reasoned argument. Reasoned arguments take time. We could say that radio, television, and internet is fast, and there's a contrast in speeds. And sometimes we don't have the ability to respond. But, well, now you can follow on as you wish. But it's true that a reasoned argument takes time, and time that a politician doesn't have on most occasions. Yes. And not everything is equally valuable. Because right now, the article of Fernando Vallespin in a newspaper, which is the result of reflection and thinking after reading 5,000 books, is equally valuable as a tweet produced by any of us. Myself, for example, by way of example. And they are considered to be of equal value, but they are not of equal value. They do not have the same value. But people don't know that. Well, we have to say this over and over again every day so that people become aware. We have to become aware. All of us have to become aware that it is not, they are not equally valuable because one of them has studies behind it. They come from a professional, accredited, with authority. And in the other case, this is not the case. And that takes time as well. And for this reason, I think that journalism has to reclaim its position and defend what it really is, what they really are. They are professionals. They have a very relevant role in society. And for this reason, I think that they have to also feel the weight of responsibility. And sorry, I just wanted to say that. I think that the media are doing what they consider they have to do. I don't think, or I don't want to say here, poor media firms, poor journalists. I mean, they're doing what they see to be appropriate. If you talk about the speed of responding, I mean, in fact, often you have to answer quickly because the group of journalists, when you leave Congress, would not accept the fact that you might not know everything 2 seconds after it's been published. And if I talk about an experience between the year 4 and 8, I spoke to MPs who were involved in TV programs, and I said to them, I don't know is a valid response. And how often do you hear politicians say, I don't know? But sometimes you really don't know. If you go into the Congress, they might say, what do you think about the views of Mr. So-and-so? And you feel obliged, or they think you're obliged to provide an answer. Well, when you have the debates, I've always tried to study the subjects. I mean, you know what you're going to be talking about, so you can study them beforehand. The night before, I would take a look at the subjects we were going to discuss. And I remember once Montoro, who is actually funnier than you might think, he said, I've heard an opinion about football, tax, and the Higgs boson. And it's like you say about the books. This article by Fernando Ayespin, that's not the same as somebody who just talks about what they saw when they went for a walk yesterday. And I think that we are under many different influences. But I would go further with something that has always concerned me. People hate politicians, we said at the start, but I don't think they hate us. I think they don't love us. I'm not working anymore in politics, and I don't want to, but don't you think that sometimes there is a bit of moral superiority from society towards politicians? And I notice this, maybe because I am more distant and I hear things differently. I try to listen to different radio programs in the morning, for example, and I hear them talking about politicians, not the latest MP who has joined, or come along, but no, the president, the leader of the opposition, the president of a regional government, with great disdain. It makes no difference which media channel, and it doesn't even need to be those who are ideologically opposed. I mean, we have right-wing and left-wing media firms and channels, we know that. But if you listen to a right-wing media channel talking about Feijóo with scorn or with disdain, and then in left-wing channels they talk about the government ministers with the same tone of voice, the same scorn. And then how can you claim authority? I mean, I'm convinced that often we do things badly, without doubt, but not everything, right? Not everything that we have done has been done badly, and I'm talking here of the profession, in the same way that the opposition and the government should be able to understand that. If the media doesn't understand it, how would the person opposite you understand it? Political party should be able to say, well, or recognise, for example, Mr. Sánchez, that's a good idea, even if they're in the opposition. And Mr. Sánchez should say, hey, you, Mr. Feijóo, what you said, good idea. Because otherwise it's impossible. It's impossible to get things wrong all the time or right all the time. But we hear this kind of moral superiority when people talk about politicians. And I think that the media are doing what they feel they should. I don't know whether the decisions come from the journalist, from the editor of the newspaper, or the director, or the owner of the firm, or the fund that is the owner of that media firm. But I think they are doing what they consider they ought to do, or that they should do. I don't think that they are, well, I don't know how it will work out. And what's more, we are looking at a time of absolute change in society. And well, now I'm getting older and I can see that I'm changing. I never watch the television. I never watch the news on the television. I watch a film, a documentary, a series, a football match, lots of football matches. But I no longer, I mean, when I was younger, not that long ago, but you used to just watch whatever came on the television. And it's the same with the radio. And who reads a newspaper from the first page to the last page, just like we used to? Nobody. So imagine the younger people. Somebody maybe who's 24 might think that I'm a joke in the way I relate to information. And I don't know whether the media will know which direction to take, but I think it's very difficult. And how can politics enter into that world? And I start to think that we're soon going to see films and series and documentaries on payment channels, documentaries about the radiant, incredible personality or terrible personality of different politicians. We may see biopics of the childhood of the person that becomes a president. We're going to start to see political information through very different channels and in different formats. You weren't here last Monday when we had 2 AI experts with us, and it was incredible. In India, with their elections, it's, well, the parties now have the possibility to personally, of course, using an avatar, an AI avatar, to talk to electors, to voters. For example, Meritxell could reach any of the people here, anybody in Spain. You take your phone and you say, "Hey, Pepe, I'm Meritxell Batet," and there's a perfect avatar, and it looks like she's talking to Pepe, and she can provide a discourse, and the algorithm measures it. They know who Pepe is and everything about him. But they said, and this is something even more fascinating, that with those kinds of campaigns, the media firms know nothing about it because it's communication between the one issuing the message and that individual. There is no public space there. And this is something really revolutionary. There's something which has always, if it's via an avatar, if the avatar does everything, I maybe might go back to politics. You know, it's an avatar for attracting people. We could choose the best, and they just create their avatars. Well, we don't have a lot of time. I wanted to. No, well, go ahead. Well, no, because he started, and in theory, it was my turn. Well, I just wanted to say one thing, because it's true that we have talked a lot about media, and I wanted to finish talking about 3 issues that I think are very important. There has been a transformation because of how we carry out politics, and it's got worse, and I think we could improve. First of all, and I'll be very brief, I would love to talk more about this, but we haven't got time. First of all, we have the use of disinformation as a battle tool, and this has increased in politics recently. We see more and more politicians who use disinformation. They use the news or information knowing that it is a lie. I think that this is very negative, because one thing is to be imprecise, or you've exaggerated perhaps when expressing your thoughts. I don't know if I'm explaining myself. I mean, there are different levels. I'm talking about the absolutely, well, this use of lies, knowing it's a lie, and you use it, and there is no kind of consequence. And this is very damaging to democracy. And the second issue, or thing that happens too often, which causes a lot of harm, is having your objective as just crushing your opposition. There is no debate for a political alternative or solution. The main and ultimate objective is to destroy the person opposite you. And personal destruction, you're destroying them at a personal level. And I think that what we're seeing now is different to what we used to see. I'm not saying that there are no such examples from 30 years ago which reflect what I'm talking about, but now it's practiced in a more widespread way. And I think that this should be banished from public life because it's terrible, terrible. And thirdly, something that's not talked about so often but is also very important, of course, we have to respect and comply with the laws, and we have to respect the Constitution. And we have to be really impeccable in doing that. But in democracy, we also have codes which go beyond a rule or a law. In its literal terms, there are unwritten rules and codes which are fundamental in order to ensure the good functioning of politics and therefore institutions and therefore democracy. And what am I referring to? I'm saying that there are things that are not prohibited or illegal or forbidden, but have been respected. For example, changing an electoral law 2 weeks before the elections without reaching a consensus. Okay, I mean, it's possible. I have the majority. I can change it, and that's all there is to it. I could give an infinite number of examples, and right now I don't want to get bogged down talking about current affairs or recent cases. And this demands self-control. Sometimes people said, don't you think we should change the regulations for the Congress to prevent certain discussions or debates? Oh, well, if only it was that simple, just to modify the regulations. There will always be a space where it is necessary for the person representing that position in power. In this space, they have to control themselves. That's basic. They have to have minimum values such as respect, avoiding insults, being polite, and not being offensive. Because I do think that the freedom of expression, not just because it's a fundamental right in the Constitution, but I think that indeed it should be very broad and understood in generous terms. But that freedom of expression, understood in a broad and generous way, will only work if we also have self-control amongst those who speak at the tribune. Those three elements, disinformation, the destruction of your adversary, and these unwritten rules, this respect for unwritten rules, are three pillars that we should look at further in order to improve the institutional quality of our democracy. I completely agree with those 3 points. We're running out of time, but two things that I wanted to have mentioned but we haven't really got time to go into them in depth. But first of all, with regards the accusation made against politicians of having a kind of wooden language. You can predict how they're going to answer. For example, the way they use words, they use certain expressions which become kind of trendy, these certain catchphrases, which we see. And on the other hand, the surprising contrast between the political world, which is more and more complex. In other words, it's really difficult to understand what is happening in certain spheres, and an explanation of politics, or an explanation of politics which is more and more simplistic. This is related to access to social media, catchy messages. And with regards to the last point, this is really incredible because it's impossible to have a discussion about subjects that go beyond a certain level of complexity. And language, in the end, becomes specialized instead of being more educational. Instead of explaining things clearly, we have this problem, different solutions. Here we have the different alternatives. We think that this one, which is the one that we are proposing and the one we support in our group, is the best for this reason and that reason. But this gets lost behind all of that, behind the gunfire between the two blocks. Would you agree with the diagnosis I've given? I mean, the first one is an accusation. I would differentiate between politicians. I mean, you've been in the Congress and you know that in the past the regulations did not allow for politicians to read their discourses, and they had to be rhetorical. They couldn't read. But now they grab their piece of paper and they just read their discourse that has been written by experts. And the image given to citizens is that of a stereotype. For example, Rajoy was very good when he spoke without papers. And you realize some politicians are very good when they don't read. Perhaps we need that kind of politician, a more, someone with more ability for rhetoric. And then, on the other hand, we have these stereotypical politicians with their wooden language. Those are two different things, though. And we don't have a lot of time, so maybe just your impressions regarding this. First of all, I think that 90% of the MPs and senators have no expert who writes their speeches, even though they read them. I don't think anybody has ever written any of my speeches. I've been a Secretary of State and an MP for many years, and nobody ever wrote any of my speeches. But if we think of Aitor Esteban maybe speaks 8 times in a plenary session or in a week, talking about 8 different things. If we take his paper away, we'd kill him, and we don't want to kill Aitor Esteban. He's a good politician. So we have to understand their situation. It may, if you ask MPs to know about everything as soon as they get into Congress, it might be reasonable for somebody to write something down for them to help them. And obviously, some people are more capable than others. And one thing that existed for a while, I think, was that there was an attempt to kind of copy the leader. This isn't just the system's fault. And I remember we had little Aznars, little Zapateros. You'd see a socialist MP that you'd seen before, and he looked different, and he'd have body language like Rubalcaba, or You know, Zapatero was easy to recognize. He had a very distinctive style, and we'd see people kind of taking on a similar form. And Feijóo doesn't have the same ability, but it concerns me, but it also doesn't concern me. But if we talk about their arguments, and there's something we haven't mentioned. If we have a leader or a political player or a party, if they don't know something, they are criticised. Unless they say, I don't know, I'll look at it later, and I still think that that functions. But there's something much worse, and that is internal discrepancy. That's just a killer. So the party apparatus, as you know, I belonged to one of them for many years. Our great madness in the mornings was to avoid discrepancies. And how do you do that? Well, by sending out your list of arguments. So first thing in the morning, if you say the government, you send out information saying the government has proposed reducing pensions by 1 point next year in order to be able to insure them for the next 50 years. And you haven't sent the list of arguments, then a politician might think that's okay in the opposition. But why can't they say if they agree? No? Of course, because they can say it. But the problem is that in politics, the media really penalize and punish discrepancies. And this, if we add to this, something I love to talk about, I am in favour of the two-party system, and I'm against the primary elections in parties. If we don't want discrepancies, and the one that wins the primary elections gets rid of all of the rest, what do we end up with? Well, small parties, very small parties. Even though there are a lot of people, the parties are small. And this automatically leads to a defensive effect, because what you have to do when you're in that kind of political party or organisation or institution is, above all, defend yourself. And that means that you will attack your adversary. You're going to want to destroy your adversary. You don't want to convince them or just beat them. You want to destroy them. And that's one of the current problems. Very quickly, and then we'll go to the Q&A from the room. Well, nothing, I'll be much quicker. You spoke about the bad side of arguments and the wooden language. I would say, well, if only we listened to the list of arguments, and if only we listened to wooden discourses, because I'm saying this to be a bit provocative, but I think that even that is disappearing, because when it comes down to it, a list of arguments has been thought through, has been worked on, often in a group. So there have been several people involved, experts often, experts in the area, who have helped to prepare those arguments. Then, indeed, there'll be people who convey it in a better or worse way. It may sound more authentic and real, or absolutely empty. And maybe sometimes the person talking about it doesn't even seem to understand it. It's just like in the theatre. You might have wardrobes on a stage, and they fill them with clothes when they're on the stage to give them substance. If you understand and have taken the arguments on board, it sounds better. But I don't think that right now that is the main problem, this excess of arguments. Here we have taken it further. We're talking about another problem, which is an absence of content, as José Luis said at the start, and I also mentioned it. You referred to it as well. That is a problem. The lack of content, because this contaminates and undermines the deliberative culture of politics and society, because we are going hand in hand. A change in one has an impact on the other. Well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. We are going to take 3 questions, and then we'll be able to answer them. Yes, here, from this gentleman. We also have some online. Let's see then. I have the feeling that in this debate there's been something important missing, which is related to public conversation. And the feeling is that we've had a discussion about logics. There's been a discussion about the functioning of politics and politicians. But I came with the idea that you were going to talk about the difficulty for communication between politicians and people in the streets, the public in general. I mean, there were many nuances, they're getting away from me, but there is a problem related to the perception of politicians. They're all the same. That expression, which is widespread, is related to the image that people have of politicians. On the one hand, the media are focusing on messages through the social media. What they do is they convey short messages, but not long messages. When I'm talking about a long message, I mean, here we're talking about a message which contains conversation and arguments, so the information that flows does not allow for thought. And another question that we can see out in the streets is that sometimes politicians look like angry children, in that nothing of what the other one has done is useful. So there is a self-contained position amongst politicians, which means that Parliament has no connection with modern times, with the society's problems. I mean, there's something in the rigid structures of parties. They impose their interests, and it's very difficult to get past that. And I'm going into a lot of detail here, perhaps. Yes, we don't have a lot of time, so Javier. Thank you very much. I think it's been very interesting. I wanted to ask one thing regarding the disappearance of internal discrepancies and internal currents of thought in parties, in political parties. I thought that was interesting because it's interesting. If I think of the main political parties, there's a lot of criticism lately of the fact that there is a lack of internal plurality and a lack of democracy within the political parties. And my question would be, what factors do you think have contributed to this lack of pluralism in political parties? And the third question at the back. Thank you. Congratulations for your contributions. All 3 of you have provided interesting ideas. I think that, well, while you were talking, I received a news item from El País newspaper that took me to Twitter. An hour ago, President Sánchez published a letter regarding the accusations against his wife, and we have this question, is this worth it? Quite honestly, I don't know. And he talks about giving up the presidency of the government. Bearing this in mind, it's in El País, that's what it says, and in the letter it says this. It talks of renouncing his presidency. I need to reflect. He suspended his agenda until the 29th, and he talks about giving up the presidency of the government. Everything we've talked about is really up to date, really relevant to what is going on absolutely right now, today. And I have to say that we three have not been guilty of that. We are not to blame, above all. I mean, well, I don't know. Start whatever you like. Perhaps the simpler one, the simplest. Regarding the elimination of internal dissidents. Internal democracy. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. I said there's no pluralism from my point of view, at least in the big parties, since we have seen the introduction of a system that ABBA already talked about, which is the winner takes it all. So when the winner takes it all in a party or in Congress, for example, in the United States, if you win by one vote, I mean, it seems unfair. It makes me think that the two main parties we had, Sanchez first, then Pablo Casado in PP, and then Feijóo, a little bit different, because that was to try to resolve a crisis in the PP. This has meant that there is no plurality or pluralism in the parties. I think that there's been a change in that regard. In the Socialist Party, I saw a more plural party in the past than I see now. That's just my sensation, that's my feeling. And what does concern me is that this means that people will no longer identify with political movements. And I'm coming here to the question about communication with the citizens, with people out there in the streets. Sometimes as citizens, we value ourselves too much, because I don't know if we really want to listen to a politician outside of the usual political fora. I remember a few years ago when I was an MP for PP, we were invited to the opening of some parliamentary offices. There were particular times for citizens to come along. Maybe it was an Anglo-Saxon system. And, well, I spent a long time there with a colleague. I got great friends. I became great friends with that MP. And, well, we were there for 3 or 4 hours. Maybe one person came along. And sometimes I'm not sure that people are that interested in politics. Well, that would be another debate. Thank you. Meritxell. And yes. Ask your question now, because we have to draw to a close. Yes, ask your question. Ask your question. The girl behind. Pepe, didn't you want to say something? I think if you ask a question, then we can finish off answering all the questions that we've had. Just one moment, yes. I just want, on behalf of the public, but at least on behalf of the ILE institution and the board, I would just like to say that I think that since, well, Since the institution was founded, there has always been great interest in strengthening a public space, a public forum within society to educate citizens, able to govern themselves, able to choose those to govern them, able to understand each other. Article 16 of the bylaws makes it very clear that it's independent of religions and political parties, defending the principles of free opinion. But really, what the institution represented has always been about understanding and tolerance. And I would really like to thank you for the two speakers' interventions, because I would say we feel that we really identify with what you've said and the feelings expressed, and they're really inspiring messages that we've heard, and they are a potential reason for hope, even though the president of the government is currently undergoing a crisis. But I think that this creates a space, and I think this seminar is all about precisely that. I would just like to say thank you. I would like to say that you really are at home here. This is your home. Thank you very much. I was saying, well, when I was in the as a speaker, I said that I wasn't going to take a position on one side or another, because I was working for the institution. But I also said I wasn't going to be neutral when it came to defending the institutions. I think that the ILE, this institution, is not related to any particular ideology, but that this does not mean it's going to be neutral when it comes to defending something that has taken a great effort to construct, which is a democracy with a whole set of institutions. And events such as this contribute to enriching this system and supporting the system. I think it's essential in a democratic society. So I take this opportunity, and this sounds like the end, although it's not. But I nonetheless would just like to say thank you for the work you have been doing for years and the organisation of seminars such as this one. I'm just going to very briefly refer to some of the comments. It's true that when you follow parliamentary debate, often you have the feeling that, well, I still talk in first person because I don't want to give the idea that I feel external. No, politicians and I accept the criticism personally because I've been working in this throughout my entire life. I feel that I'm a politician, but it's true that we are sometimes talking about things far from reality. And as a speaker, you have more time to think because you are just listening. I mean, I really was. When I worked as a speaker, I was listening and trying to understand because, well, I mean, I had to pay attention in case any issue cropped up or if there was any problem. And often I went home with that feeling. The fact that in Congress they weren't talking about what people are interested in or what they were talking about in their homes. And I have got messages saying, I switched my television off because you were just insulting each other and arguing. You're not saying anything useful. And people were really angry about what they saw. And this is very difficult to fix by means of a regulation or by leading a debate. This is solved, as I said, by encouraging self-control for each one to think that they're discourse is something that they're going to leave behind. You know, their children will be able to leave it in the future. I mean, if you think about it that way, that encourages you to really devote time to preparing your speeches, because they will be there forevermore. Not just academics or historians will read them in the future, but maybe one day a child of yours might say, oh, I'll have a look at what mum or dad said when they spoke in the Congress, and you may feel really embarrassed. I think that these things are important. And the comments were really relevant. If we talk about internal currents, perhaps not in a very explicit way, but there were internal currents. For example, if you're in the government, it's much more difficult to have internal explicit currents because you're in the government and it's a kind of machinery. We have the ministers and ministries defining policies, and internal currents are not going to start questioning what each ministry is trying to do. Depending on whether you're in government or in the opposition, that changes. But without doubt, I agree with José Luis in that the primary election system is not the only possible democratic system in a political party. And what's more, I don't think it's the best system, nor do I think it boosts internal democracy for political parties, because indeed, and this is, well, it's the same in all majority systems, or with the direct election of a leader. You have the leader and then the masses, and in between there's nothing. And a political party always has to have intermediary levels. Here we're talking about something fundamental. Here we need territorial leaders. We need people who are specialists in different areas, people with a voice and authority at an internal level. And indeed, the primary system doesn't make this easy. It doesn't entirely prevent it, but it doesn't make it easier for the consolidation of these senior levels. I think there are systems that could respond to internal democracy without having the rough edges created by primary election systems. And with regards to the news that you told us, I'm not going to reflect on that. I just refer to the arguments used by José Luis or Fernando. The fact that when you're in a conversation, news items would crop up. I mean, I don't comment on different views. I can defend policies. I can talk about projects, for example. But to comment on comments, well, that's difficult. But Fernando? Yes, you can finish. No, just to talk about the internal currents again. There are different currents. Maybe what I'm missing, though, are opinions. We don't have to have currents, but maybe someone thinking, I mean, what we had in the past were different ways of thinking, but this has changed and been replaced. The only ones who can have a different opinion to the leader are the ones who have real power, the so-called barons. And this means there is no perfect democracy. I mean, we never have a perfect democracy, but we can have more perfect. In a party, if you have, who is most important, an important mayor. I mean, if we just have, a member, a grassroots member, they might say, I think that the government is making a mistake in this policy. It's more complicated. And I think we would agree with regards primary elections. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.